Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. Ukraine War news update, first part thereof for the 1st of September 2024. I have released a breaking news update concerning the massive drone strike of Ukraine onto Russia, particularly at their power infrastructure. You can go and watch out for a little bit more detail about what I will be mentioning, of course, in this video. I said today's scheduling for my content will be pretty screwed up because it's into sporting season for my kids, but actually my partner's taken one of my boys to rugby practice this morning. So because I said, look, there's an awful lot of content, there's this massive attack, so she's done that, and I'm doing these videos at the moment before being out for the whole afternoon. So there will still be some issues with content timing today, but the main ones will be out on time. So this is the Ukrainian General Staff figures for the Russian losses for the day before, all the usual caveats apply, of course, as ever. And another very deadly day for Russia. The Russian soldiers, says Tim White here, and he's absolutely right. By the way, if you don't know the caveats that I apply, you can read them in the description to the video below. So 1,350 personnel lost is a second day of numbers over 1,300, exceptionally high. We're used to a range at the moment, last few months, or maybe longer. We've seen numbers from 1,000 to 1,300. All of those numbers in those ranges are massively high because it's well over 1,000. That's our arbitrary kind of benchmark for a massive day, a day of massive losses. Earlier on in the war, we were thinking 600 was a bad day, 800 is a bad day. Now it's been normalized, I think, that Russia is taking these losses that exceed 1,000 a day every day, and when it dips to just below 1,000, we're like, oh my goodness, that's a really low day, when in fact 950 is an exceptionally bad day for the Russians still, but we've just been skewed in our perception. So 1,350, very bad for the Russians. 10 tanks, just above the daily average, as we I think see that the Russians are attacking again. We've seen an uptick in some of these combat asset losses, just marginally, a little bit over the last few days, where they had dropped really low. So I think yesterday there were 8 tanks lost, today 10. And that shows that they are attacking. They are putting together these big mechanized attacks, big in relative terms, because at the beginning of the war, you might have seen 30 vehicles or 60 vehicles. Now we're seeing a big attack is usually 15 vehicles. That's kind of the biggest attack you'll see at the moment. Generally, they're sort of 5, 3s and so on. But we've seen some of these big attacks again. It looks like the Russians have been stockpiling, ready to go again in particularly the Pokrovsk area south of Pokrovsk as well. So 24 troop-carrying AFVs is above the daily average, and that's what we would expect if the Russians are going at it again. Interestingly, artillery systems has dropped, and we've had a couple of days now of much lower numbers. Even if they are well above the daily average, they're still, I mean, that is just above the daily average, but that is much lower. So when we're seeing some days like 60 odd artillery pieces lost, then 22 seems like it's a very poor day, even though that is above average, and that's a very useful number of artillery systems for the Ukrainians to degrade of the Russian, artillery capacity. 56 vehicles and fuel tanks and 14 pieces of special equipment is pretty high in those categories too. Now, no Andrew Perpetua loss stats out yet. Knowing my luck, he'll probably release them just after I release this video, but I'll check at the end of the video to see if he has. So let's look at a few bits and pieces, try and piece together an idea of what's going on the front lines. Russians have shown the aftermath of a missile strike or of missile strikes on an ammunition and equipment depot of the Russian army in Bakhmut. We don't really hear of strikes there very often. Donetsk region, Russians claim it was a storm shadow. Don't have a clue whether that is true, but I thought I'd throw that one in there, that we might have an example of a storm shadow causing some really widespread destruction here, or storm shadows, to ammunition and possibly equipment, although I can't see too much equipment there, but certainly a lot of damage done to supposedly an ammunition and equipment depot. Okay, then when there's just another bit of... it's one of these bits of footage that I find interesting. So when you watch a lot of action films, you see random bits of stuff burning, that when they set fire to things to show, oh yeah, there's been an explosion here, and you get random pockets of almost fake fire going on where the pyrotechnics teams have set fire to them. Actually, here's one of the bits of footage where you actually get that, where strikes just happened, vehicles have been absolutely mauled, melted, totally taken out, and then random bits of fire going off here and there, and this wheel is on fire. You're thinking, okay, rubber, yeah, but you're looking at stuff thinking, well, that's just a bit of ground on fire. That's a bit of metal that looks like it's on fire. Anyway, genuinely happens. So here we have a number of bits of equipment, a massive howitzer there being towed by a truck, absolutely taken out. So this is footage of a strike, War Translator says, mentioned earlier, where, well, actually, he refers to it down here. The video came from the Russian servicemen and shows the result of the attack by the Ukrainian FPV drone. Electronic warfare didn't help. This is Dozier Shipiona shares photos of a combat vehicle, Ural, from the Russian 120th Artillery Brigade, hit by an FPV drone in Novosyolovka Pervaya in Donetsk Oblast. Yeah, thanks for that. Truck was carrying a Gyatsin B howitzer and around 30 Krasnopol shells. Now that's a very useful strike then, because these are the laser guided shells that are really accurate. Everything's been destroyed, he says there. Really accurate shells, and that's really good to see those taken out. Random bits of fire, wheels on fire. It is, yeah, I let you off set production experts who do just set fire to random things, and yeah, that seems to be what happens. Okay, and then we have this. So no report saying the 59th Brigade repelled a large Russian attack, near Pokrovsk, destroying 12 out of 16 armored vehicles. So this is a sort of evidence that then feeds into 10 tanks, 24 AFVs being destroyed yesterday by the Ukrainians. This is another large attack. Pokrovsk is really suffering. I mean, 2 days ago, it was 58 attacks in that area alone. But yeah, so incredibly fierce battle, says no reports, with Russian forces attempting to advance on Pokrovsk. The Ukrainian troops faced an assault of 16 heavy armored vehicles and several waves of infantry attacks. Despite the odds, the brigade managed to destroy 12 of the armored vehicles, with the remaining ones retreating. Confirmed Russian losses include 93 infantry soldiers. So that one attack, it leads to like a 14th of what was lost yesterday by the Russians in terms of personnel. That's just one attack, and those vehicles probably account for maybe 16 out of 34 is half the vehicles listed in this list would have been lost in that attack, assuming that happened on the same day, etc., etc. Now, on the other hand, because I don't want to just say, look at all these Russian losses, whoop-de-whoop, aren't the Ukrainians brilliant? Where the attacking side is attacking, they will lose more stuff. So you'd expect the Ukrainians to lose a lot of stuff up in Kursk and Sumy area, where they are pushing their vehicles into the contact zone. Now, this is potentially what we see here. So War Vehicle Tracker last night, who is pro-Ukrainian but releases a lot of stuff that is Ukrainian equipment being destroyed, and then people say, oh, you're just a Russian simp or whatever, and actually he's not, but he's just fairly saying, look, this has happened, that's happened. And this one was a Tornado S cluster and high explosive airburst strike, so where you have submunitions come out, or it explodes above and shrapnel goes down, different kind of ways of doing it, on a massive Ukrainian truck convoy carrying supplies to the Kursk area. This is the first claim. TLDR, by the way, it's not that. Most areas of the column were affected, so it's safe to say that most vehicles are damaged or destroyed. And this is where we get, let's have a look at this footage. Of course, it's going to have lots of sound effects. So I think, yeah, so we get aerial nocturnal footage, explosions, airburst, so on and so forth. And that's supposedly hitting a big old convoy. And then we have geolocation of that, and etc., etc. Okay, so he goes on to say high explosive, possibly airburst and cluster, and then other people then joined in the conversation, said, I don't really see anything getting blown up. This is nothing much ado about nothing. He then comes back and says, okay, all of these things are within the kind of target area of stuff getting blown up, so on and so forth. So this was all like, oh dear, looks like a Ukrainian supply convoy has been hit in Sumy trying to supply Kursk. Then information's come out that actually it wasn't that. So airstrikes included Iskander on a Ukrainian convoy near Sumy, but it seems they hit grain trucks. So using the same footage and then looking at destruction then on the road of where this was. And there you have clearly a grain convoy with explosions and flaming trucks. Then says here Sarin, the source Sarin, gives you the Russian claims. And the Russian claims, he says, are just plain lies. So the Russian claims are that their artillery destroyed a column of Ukrainian armed forces in the Sumy region, which is heading towards Sudzha. According to preliminary estimates, the enemy lost up to 300 people and over 20 units of equipment at a time. So remember, when the Russians make these big claims and put numbers on them, and you might be either wanting to give credibility to the Russians or worried that might be true, or you're just a Russian sympathizer trying to spread disinformation. What we must do when we listen to these claims is really, if it's a Russian claim, disbelieve it to begin with. Say, I don't believe that until I've got requisite evidence. Whereas over time, I mean, this is called inductive reasoning, right? It's kind of like how betting works in form with horses. So, you're much more likely to bet on a horse that has won 200 times in a row rather than a horse that's lost 200 times in a row. Don't cry wolf. This is I could get formal about how to do this using kind of Bayesian reasoning and probability analysis. But the idea is that, if the horse has won 200 times in a row, then I'm going to back that horse for this next race. So if you say, right, the Ukrainian General Staff have been pretty accurate with what they've been saying. And how do we know this? Because actually Andrew Perpetua is releasing loss stats, and we look at all of these claims over the course of 2.5 years and we go, right, actually it's broadly accurate. And even if it's not 100% if it's not 100% accurate, then the trends are accurate, right? So that you can take 10% off it or whatever, but it's consistently so. And that's what we have seen. I've shown you this over the course of the war, so that when the Ukrainians say we have hit a convoy, when the Ukrainians say this about a Russian convoy being hit, then we're in a good position to say it's probably true that the Ukrainians have hit a Russian convoy. And when they say we think that 50 people might have died there, then we go, there's a good chance of that being true. But when the Russians do the same, right, and they say 300 people have been killed, 20 units of equipment have been taken out, and this is a Ukrainian military convoy heading into Kursk from Sumy, then the first thing we should do is this horse has lost 200 times in a row. It's not won a race, or wins once in a blue moon. So my first reaction should be, I don't believe it. I don't believe you until you give me the requisite evidence that this definitely is true. So the claim is 300 people dead, 20 people or 300 people lost, 20 bits of equipment lost. Among them were civilian trucks. Okay, now among them were civilian trucks with the help of the Ukrainian soldiers tried to secretly transfer part of the personnel. Okay, so lots of things going on here, because this could be true as well. But the problem is they're so often lying. So this is possible. It could be that the Ukrainians are transporting a lot of military equipment in civilian trucks to try and cover up that military activity. Thing is, if you've got a bunch of grain trucks operating near that area, there are lots of arguments. One, really, are you going to be operating grain removal at that? But this is harvest time, and this is how they get their money. And we know that farms right on contact zones are still using combine harvesters. I saw videos the other week of literally trenches over there and a farmer doing combine harvester work here. And you're like, really? And yes, they do this. So they are farming because this is their livelihood, and this is Ukraine's livelihood as well. They can't fund their defensive war if they don't make money out of their agriculture. So are you likely to see 20 grain trucks operating in Sumy area? Yeah. Are they likely to operate in a convoy? I don't know enough about how grain convoys operate and how harvest season looks in Ukraine. So either of these could be correct. Like either Russia have hit a genuine grain convoy, or there are a number of civilian vehicles being used by the Ukrainians to supply their military forces in Kursk. Those are both possible and indeed both kind of plausible, but the Russians lie more often than the Ukrainians. So I am left thinking I need more evidence to definitely show me that the Russians are being truthful here. So the Russian claim is our scouts spotted a column of Ukrainian troops from a drone 5 kilometers from the village of whatever. Our troops decided not to rush the attack and let the enemy accumulate the maximum amount of equipment and manpower. After that, the artillerymen launched a massive attack from heavy MLRS and Iskanders. According to military bloggers, the number of 300 people may increase. Before that, in the Chuguev area of the Kharkiv region, our troops defeated another column of the Ukrainian armed forces, which included Grad multiple launch rocket systems, French armoured combat vehicles, and a dozen tractors with trailers bearing the Red Cross symbols under the guise of vehicles from the International Humanitarian Committee. The Ukrainians also tried to transfer some of the manpower. Our troops tracked the transshipment base in Kochetki, confirmed that the trucks were not transporting supplies for the civilian population, and passed the information on to headquarters. Okay, so lots of claims about these two, so possibly two strikes on Ukrainian equipment being disguised as either humanitarian aid or grain shipments. The reality here is that we can see a whole bunch of Ukrainian civilian vehicles in trouble, and there is no evidence. And this is, bear in mind, this is stuff that's on fire. So these are photographs that are taken, pretty much straight away here. There appears to be no military equipment there. So I don't know. No report says yeah, but no. Russia launched a missile strike on a convoy of grain trucks in Sumy. The attack occurred at the Sumy-Kharkiv route near the village of that one that I didn't want to pronounce. As a result, a 23-year-old truck driver was killed and 4 other drivers were injured. One truck caught fire and around 20 vehicles were damaged. So make of this what you will. Some people calling War Vehicle Tracker here a clown for believing the Russian account initially. I don't know. I wouldn't be so harsh. I think War Vehicle Tracker has been very useful. But whether it is a military, either believe the Russian account or you believe the Ukrainian account. I would err to the side of believing the Ukrainians first and foremost, just as I always will, because they've got much, much better form. So I'll always back that horse just on statistics. And then in order to back the Russian horse, I would need far more evidence that horse is going to win this time. So the level of evidence required is actually higher for the Russians than it is for the Ukrainians. You might call that unfair, but that's basically how Bayesian probability analyses work, right? In order to overcome a low prior probability, so before we look at any evidence, it's much more likely that the Russians are lying. So in order to overcome this idea, in order to believe that they weren't lying, you need much more posterior probability, much higher posterior probability, which means the actual evidence needs to be far higher than normal to overcome the low prior. With the Ukrainians, you have a high prior probability, which means that before we look at any evidence, we've got good reason already to believe that the Ukrainians are being truthful, and therefore their posterior probability need only be yay high. It doesn't need to be as high. So the evidence doesn't need to be as high because we've got such good priors as to these guys being believable. So there are different thresholds of evidence that you can apply to the Ukrainians and the Russians to get to whether you're justified in believing them. Okay, and that's important to understand. So I'm not being unfair to the Russians. The Russians are being unfair to themselves by lying so often. Okay, anyway, moving on. So no report says today around 11 a.m., so that's yesterday, Ukrainian Air Force troops shot down a Russian Orion drone in the Kursk direction. The Orion is a medium altitude, long endurance UAV aerial drone used by the Russian military since 2020 for reconnaissance and can carry up to 200 kilograms of combat payload. So that's significant, including air to surface missiles. So that's a big old drone to have shot down. It's sort of like the Reaper drones that are being phased out. Well, certainly the MQ-1 is being phased out, isn't it? So the Ukrainians could, in principle, get hold of a bunch of MQ-1 Reaper drones as they become obsolete, and the Americans have an absolute ton of them. Don't know how useful they would be for the Ukrainians. But anyway, the Russian Orion equivalent there shot down yesterday. Now, talking about Moonfish, the F-16 fighter jet and pilot and jet that was lost on Monday. This is the quote from the Wall Street Journal. Remember, it talks about American-made F-16 when it likely wasn't an American-made one. It's probably Belgian constructed with other elements in all over Europe. Anyway, the Ukrainian Defense Force do not believe the pilot error was behind the incidents. The source added, the pilot, Alexei Mez, known as Moonfish, was killed in the crash while repelling the biggest ever aerial attack by Russia against Ukraine. He was buried on Thursday. According to the military, the F-16 shot down 4 Russian cruise missiles during the attack, demonstrating high efficiency. During an approach to the next target, communication with one of the jets was lost. As it turned out later, the plane crashed. The pilot was killed, General Staff said. And possibly as a result of friendly fire from a Patriot battery. So there are some people suggesting that it was friendly fire, as I've mentioned previously. If we just look at this translation, according to my information, the F-16 and the Ukrainian pilot's Moonfish was shot down by Patriot anti-aircraft missile system due to lack of coordination between the units. In the reports, it was noted that he failed to manage. The event happened during one of the most powerful Russian air attacks on August 26th. War is war, and episodes are possible. Such episodes are possible, but the culture of lies in the Air Force Command of the Armed Air Forces of Ukraine, as well as in other higher military headquarters, leads to the fact that the system of managing military decisions does not improve on the basis of truthful, consistently collected analytics, but deteriorates and even collapses, as is happening in the Pokrovsk direction. And one of the generals was punished. Oleshchuk remains in office, and none of the generals were punished, and General Oleshchuk remains in office. So this was a claim originally, and now we've heard that Oleshchuk, the commander in charge of the Air Force, has been removed. And then the denial that this was anything to do with that F-16 going down, but it does seem rather coincidental. So it might well have been connected to the death of Moonfish and the loss of the F-16. So who knows? But just throwing some of these ideas out there for you, not muddying the waters. These are genuine claims coming out. So speaking on condition of anonymity, says Rob Lee, quoting now from Pravda Ukrainska, the official said that various lines of inquiry are being considered, including friendly fire from Ukrainian air defenses, a technical malfunction and pilot error. Friendly fire is not uncommon, by the way, at all. You know, Americans done this. Like the only Challenger 2 tank that's ever been lost in combat was lost due to friendly fire from the Americans. So, you know, the blue on blue happens, and it happens fairly frequently, has done throughout, you know, recent modern wars. Ukrainians are not going to be inoculated from these sort of things happening. But the exact reasons will be known only after the completion of the investigation, he said. A Western official who has been briefed on the preliminary investigation in the air crash said that there were indications that friendly fire from a Patriot missile battery might have brought down the jet, though mechanical failure and pilot error have not been ruled out. So, yeah, you can make up your own mind on that. Right, last night in Moscow, so not only were the Moscow emergency services dealing with the attacks that we're going to talk about on Moscow and oil refineries and power plants and whatnot, but also here we have a burned car of a certain Evgeny Nechayev, who has his own business in the Chechen Republic. Presumably he had a financial conflict with the Chechens. Ministry of Internal Affairs is silent. Ministry of Internal Affairs does not have a financial conflict with the Chechens. Okay, so a fire, you know, some key person's car burning in Moscow, that has happened. Now, it's also worth reminding you that the only the other day, the Moscow emergency services claimed that the Ukrainians were gearing up for a big attack, right? And they said, we need to be on extra duties, emergency services in the Moscow area until like September the 6th or something like that. Lo and behold, actually, they were right. So the Russians had obviously got information that there were going to be attacks. Those attacks took place last night, and they were significant. Does that mean the Russians were in a better position to deal with those attacks because they had reason to believe they were taking place? Had they put extra air defenses in position? Were people on extra alert? Possibly. So it could be that more of the Ukrainian drones were shot down than otherwise might have been the case because there were some leaks. Probably as well understandable, given the number of people that would have had to have been used in Ukraine to fire 158 attack drones into Russia. Anyway, the Russians into Ukraine, by contrast, and we'll talk about the massive drone strike in a second, but the Russians had a fairly quiet night in attacking Ukraine. So what do we have? In contrast to Russia, the air defense of Ukraine had a fairly quiet night. However, an Iskander missile and 3 drones were still evaded capture, as 8 out of 11 drones were shot down. So only 11 drones sent in. 3 of them got through, as did an Iskander missile. So don't know what destruction they caused, but 8 drones were shot down by the Ukrainians. Then we're talking about Russia. Like early doors last night, there was talk about over 100 drones going into different regions of Russia. That was in the middle of the night last night. Lots of video footage coming out of the sound of drones going over different regions, explosions in a number of places. And then this morning, we wake up to the Russians claiming that 158 drones were shot down. And that's kind of all of the drones were shot down. But then there's evidence of power plants being hit and oil refineries being hit. Some evidence of drones being brought down by electronic warfare in residential areas like the one there in Moscow. And that was, definitely not the target. It's coming down almost sideways in that one. And then other imagery of drones not coming, there it goes again from a different angle. Other drones not coming down artificially, but hitting their desired target. So definitely some targets were hit last night. The Russians are, again, we're going back to lying. The Russians are definitely lying. They haven't shot down all the drones. But their claims are they shot down 46 over Kursk, 34 over Bryansk, 28 over Voronezh, 14 over Belgorod, and all these regions on the way up to Moscow, to the point it looks like a corridor of targets all the way northwards to Moscow from Ukraine. So a number of different targets on the way there. These kind of stop-off points on the way to Moscow. One of them, the main targets was we have a power station in Tver. We have sort of drones, the Lyuty drone there, lots of imagery of drones. We've got imagery as well, video imagery of air defenses going off in Moscow, right in the middle of residential areas here. So there you go. That's just firing off in the middle of a residential area or commercial area there. So lots of activity taking place. We had here the Tver power plant is that, and also so this is Konakovo. So interesting. So you got the strike on the Konakovo power plant there, which was then extinguished that fire. It looks like it's damaged pipes and whatnot, but it's fairly cosmetic potentially. And then you have a substation, possibly a gas substation, hit over somewhere else as well. So several strikes around Konakovo. As mentioned here, 2 fires in Russia's Tver Oblast, northwest of Moscow, after drone attacks. Russian sources say Konakovo thermoelectric power station and a gas distribution facility were hit. Russia deployed helicopters to extinguish a fire at the Moscow oil refinery, as well as, the essential point is that the Russians might have shot down an awful lot of these drones because there isn't a huge amount of footage coming out of blown up stuff, burning things that you might normally see. But there is some evidence of success here at the Konakovo power plant. It looks like that fire was put out. Some of these pipes were damaged. Is that going to affect the integrity of the power station? What are the processes that have been affected there? There are claims that it has shut down as 7 to 8 drones hit there or thereabouts. And of course, if you've got substations being hit as well, you've also got Yaroslavl being added to the target list, as we have evidence that they've shut down roads there. The police have cordoned off roads, as that is a region that could well have been hit as well. What else to add? Just that the thermal power plant there in Konakovo is the 8th biggest one in Russia. and that looked like it was in a spot of bother, but it may have been sorted. We don't know. I mean, that's quite a fire coming from there, but it does appear to be out at the moment. But there are claims that they are taking photos of some places from different angles to not show where there could potentially be issues. Russian Telegram channels report a drone attack on Kashira State District power plant in the Moscow region. Also in Tver region, there are 2 fires after drone attacks. So that's what we talked about. That's the Tver, but Kashira as well. So there are explosions, burning things. How much damage has been caused? I guess we'll have to wait to see as more information emerges throughout the day. Tim White has a good thread to keep up to date on what happens throughout the day. Null reports and some of these other ones online as well. Keep a good handle on daily events, but certainly an awful lot taking place, and possibly some real chaos caused by the Ukrainians to the Russian energy infrastructure. And as I said in my breaking news piece, the question is going to be how the Russian population reacts. Do they unite behind a common enemy, unite behind the Kremlin and Putin, or are they 2.5 years into this war, realizing it's coming to them and start getting pissed off with Putin? It could go either way, and it could go both ways. You could have some people in Russia saying this is enough and getting a bit discordant about their government and about what's going on, or you could have people getting behind them, more people signing up to join the army to have a go at these Ukraine Nazis or whatever. The state are going to be painting this in their own inimitable way, of course, and they're going to be aiming to get the Russian population on their side, to justify any kind of action back to Ukraine, to justify even full-on mobilization. So something like this could have the undesired effect of justifying a full national mobilization, and that not being massively unpopular with the Russian population, because they see their nation being attacked, the center of their nation being attacked by the Ukrainians. So this is going to be really interesting to see how the fallout is managed by the Russians here. Now, on top of that, and we'll look in a second if there's anything else to add, but on top of that, the Atlas oil depot in Rostov region, this is what it looked like yesterday, which is exactly what it looked like the day before and the day before and the day before. Here the claim is it will meet the same fate as a Prototarsk oil depot, which pretty much burnt out, and the whole of it was destroyed, or at least affected. Now, Null report says today that the Atlas depot in Rostov region has been burning for a 5th consecutive day. That's what it looks like. There's still quite a lot of unaffected tanks here, though. As Maccaberry said the other day, don't think that these aren't affected. There will be some kind of thermal metallurgical issues going on here. But yeah, potentially a lot more burning can take place at that Atlas refinery. Okay, and moving on to other bits and pieces, not a lot to say really. It's all been about those strikes overnight. A dismissal of Air Force Commander Mykola Oleshchuk was not connected to the deadly crash of the F-16 fighter jet earlier in the week, says the Defense Minister Rustem Umerov in an interview with CNN. So the official line is no, it had nothing to do with it, but it does look rather coincidental, especially when people are complaining about Oleshchuk for not being truthful enough about what's going on, etc., etc. So it wouldn't surprise me if it was indeed connected, but it also wouldn't surprise me if it wasn't, because rotations and movements happen in times of peace as well as times of war in military hierarchies, and you would expect this kind of movement to happen anyway at some point. Just checking the sources to see if there are any other bits of information that I can glean. This is a Moscow oil refinery not looking in the best of health. I'm sure that's going to have an effect on the processes that take place there. And the way I understand it, I don't know, some people were I don't know if this is entirely true, but I presume there's some kind of linear process that goes on here, and there aren't lots of these things going on in parallel at these refineries. So it's not, you might have 4 sets of processes going on at once, or you might have one big process. I would assume that, well, either way, if you affect some part of this, then the whole process stops working, whether it's one large process or lots of parallel processes, and it just affects one of these, it's still going to affect the output, right? But it's important that all elements of the process work. Otherwise, you can't refine the product there. So, this is going to be effective hitting these oil refineries. You affect them in most places. You're going to stop the refining process from taking place. Now, there are some things that are more difficult to fix than others, some things that are going to be more catastrophic than others, but any kind of hit is going to hurt. There's some more footage of the oil refinery being hit there. Now, just to go back to what War Vehicle Tracker was saying, he's now saying this. So the latest is, it seems to have indeed been a grain convoy. Russians wasted at least one Iskander and 4 Tornado S-cluster missiles. And there we have at least prima facie evidence that it was a grain convoy and that these were civilian elements being hit. You could still, if you're a Russian, you probably could still try and argue that actually they were hiding military equipment inside, but there's no evidence that the Ukrainians were doing that. It appears prima facie that there was indeed a grain convoy, unless shown otherwise. And the Russians can say what they like, but until they show evidence for what they're saying, we'll believe what we're seeing with our eyes and what the claims are from the Ukrainians. Anyway, that's enough from me. Take care, guys. Speak to you soon.